When I first started my photography journey, one of the things I wish I had was a mentor. Probably like most of you, I scoured countless hours of YouTube to learn. It's been about 8 years since I started my journey. Within that time, I learned a lot, and I made a ton of mistakes along the way. If I was to start all over again, this is the type of advice I wish I got within the first year or two. So let's just get started. And mistake number 1 is never printing your images. Wow, this sounds weird. Hello. Now you may be thinking, it's not worth printing my images. I only want to post on Instagram and Facebook. However, that's a big mistake. There's just something else while holding your photos physically that just makes you feel way more connected to your photos. Something about scrolling through photos through an iPad or on your phone just doesn't have the same appeal. To be honest, I didn't print any of my photos for the first 4 years. I found a medium format printer that was on sale. It's not a super fancy printer, but it's capable of printing up to 13 by 19 photos. And the larger you print your photos, the more they come to life. Oh, this is not a good spot. This is all bad spots for this. I started framing my own photos, putting them up around my house. I was gifting them out for friends and families for their weddings. Honestly, the best feeling is when you gifted someone a photo and you see it on their display somewhere in their house. It's just like, oh, yes. Cool, you actually liked it. And honestly, I would easily trade 100,000 likes for just one of my friends putting up my photo on their wall instead. See, just start off by printing a few 4x6 images. By the time you print off your first large print, you'll be hooked on printing. Mistake number 2 is investing in the wrong gear. Honestly, photography can be a money pit. There's so many options, and buying the best and most expensive equipment doesn't make sense for a lot of people. There's a term called GAS, which is Gear Acquisition Syndrome. Basically, in a nutshell, is acquiring as much gear as you can that will make you feel like you're getting better, when really buying more gear doesn't have an impact at all. Unless you're working professionally or have a very specific niche type of photography you're trying to capture, there's a ton of alternatives than buying just the best and fastest lenses out there. And buying the fastest and largest lenses is a literal huge mistake. I see a ton of hobbyists make this mistake. A quick 20-30 minute outing with 2.8 zoom or a 1.2 prime isn't so bad, but having to carry that for an hour or more is incredibly draining, especially when you have another lens or two in the back of your bag and you're carrying all that weight too. It's literally just too much gear for a lot of hobbyists. And this is where I see a lot of early photographers starting to lose their interest in photography, is because they bought so much gear that they're sick of carrying it around. This is why for non-professional photographers, usually we'll just push them to buying f4 zooms or slower f2 primes. Not only these are way lighter, but they're also way more affordable. You'll use these lenses way more. I personally had a lot of gas in the tank, and when I did, this is when I used my camera the least. It just felt way too cumbersome to pull out my camera, and I ended up just leaving my whole camera bag at home all the time. Ever since I started buying slower compact lenses, I just have a way better appreciation for photography. Mistake number 3 is being scared of high ISO. Now, if you're using high ISOs, yes, you're gonna get more digital noise, which is definitely a big issue back in the day, but nowadays sensors have just gone incredibly good, and low light performance is usually great on all cameras. When I first started shooting, I was borrowing my friend Lewis's Canon T3, and I thought anything over 4000 ISO would be pretty much garbage. So I was always compromising my shutter speed to keep a lower ISO essentially. But the truth I learned after years of shooting is digital noise is always something that's going to be there, and there's so many tools now that can fix that, but something you can't fix is motion blur. Anything with too much motion blur was way worse. A sharp image shot with a high ISO will always look better than a blurry motion blur mess. Now, I'm really dumbing this down, but as a rule of thumb for myself, no matter what lens I'm using, I'll always aim to have at least a 1/60 shutter. Mistake number 4 is shooting everything in RAW. Now, if you're not shooting in RAW at all, that's definitely a big mistake. But shooting RAW for everything is definitely a worse mistake. Now, for professional use, I would always shoot RAW, but for personal use, I'll use them interchangeably depending on the situation. Chances are you're going to be taking photos for a lot of different situations, and if you're shooting RAW, it just means you're adding extra steps to sharing your images. You'll have to back them up, edit them, and export them. A lot of the time, you're probably not going to have the time to edit these images for a long time. Life kind of just happens. I'm sure you'll eventually get around to it, but it'll probably be a couple weeks later or even months. So personally, I shoot everything in JPEG and RAW. I'll just share the JPEGs immediately after the event, and having RAWs there as a backup in case I wanted to edit any of the images later. Mistake number 5 is not subscribing to this channel. I can't even do it for real. Okay, I'm just gonna skip this. Mistake number 5 is overly trusting your viewfinder and LCD screens and not using your histogram or zebras. Now, unless you got a really high-end camera, chances are your LCD screen and your viewfinder aren't going to be very accurate. There's a ton of times I thought my photo was going to be well exposed, but then later in post, realized my exposure was just way too bright or just way too dark. There's a bunch of tools that are going to be built into your camera. Just learning your way around them is pretty much essential. That easily could have been avoided if I just looked at my histogram when I was taking the photo. Now, it's a little bit too much for me to explain into this video, so to dumb it down, it's basically just this chart that your camera is going to display to you. This side will be your highlights and this side will be your darks, and everything in between is basically your midtones. Generally, you just want your exposure somewhere in here. Now, that's a very simplified explanation of a histogram, and if you want to learn more, definitely look into it. And the other tool you can use is zebras, which will be this little pattern here, which is basically the camera telling you that this object is too bright and I won't be able to recover any detail if you try to darken the image afterwards. So when you start to see that pattern, you'll know your photo is getting a little too bright and maybe you should dial back down. You can also change the threshold of zebras. So instead of showing up at 100%, it'll show up at 80%. And if you're using these two tools along with shooting in RAW, your photos are pretty much guaranteed to come out correctly. Now, this one's controversial. Mistake number 6 is buying tripods. Now, tripods are a key piece of equipment for a lot of photographers, and a lot of people buy tripods and they don't use them. So if you're only interested in shooting portraits or street photography or just like family events, if you're never going to use a tripod, just don't bother. Just save yourself a couple $100s and use it somewhere else. However, mistake number 7 is not buying a tripod. Now, I hate carrying tripods. They add a ton of weight and they can feel pretty cumbersome. But like I said, tripods are a key piece of photography equipment. They open the world of possibilities that basically wouldn't be possible to do handheld. And honestly, when it comes to tripods, there's 3 things to consider. And the first one is obviously price. This is really not something that's worth cheaping out on because in the last 7 years, I've broken over 10 tripods. I spent way more money buying cheap tripods, and if I just spent that money on a good one from the get-go, I definitely would have saved myself probably $700, $800 by now. And the other things to consider is size and weight. This is where I tell most people, find the one that you're willing to carry and then buy one size down because tripods are heavy. If you get one that's way too big, chances are it's just gonna live in the trunk or in the corner of your office. Best tripod that you can afford at the size that you're willing to carry. That is the key to tripods. Unless the photography that you're doing is really heavily reliant on a nice sturdy tripod, it's definitely worth investing in a quality, lightweight, compact tripod. The next mistake is not thinking about your long-term file storage. Now, if you're just starting out, it's probably not a big deal. However, as your photo library expands, you definitely want to think of file redundancy and having backups. This is something I cannot stress enough. Hard drives and SSDs can fail, and cloud storage gets really expensive once your library grows to a substantial level. Also, not having a place to consolidate all your images to also means your photos are going to live across multiple smaller drives. Finding older photos is just super cumbersome when you don't know if it's on hard drive A or hard drive B or C or D or E or whatever. What I recommend for most people is once your library goes past a few terabytes, I totally recommend purchasing a RAID storage solution. To have a simplified explanation of what this is, it's a device that has multiple hard drives in it and consolidates all the storage capacity to one hard drive. So when you plug it into your computer, it just looks like one hard drive instead of having 4, 5, 6, whatever hard drives. If you have a hard drive in here that fails, you can just pull it right out and toss a brand new one in, and the device will fix itself. You don't have to worry about file loss because your file is going to be saved multiple times in the RAID storage solution itself. This basically brings your chances of losing any of your files down to 0 unless you have a fire or a flood, but chances are that's not going to happen. Now, relating to this topic of file storage is mistake number 8, not sorting and organizing your images into a system. Honestly, this is one of my most regrettable mistakes. Not including any weddings or events, I've shot over 40,000 personal images over the last 10 years. When I first started photography, I was just backing up my images to Lightroom and letting Lightroom figure out where it was going to store these files. However, Lightroom default storage importer is basically useless trying to remember what your photos actually are. It just sorts all your photos by date, and sometimes if your camera resets, the date resets dates also. So it'll say like 2016, and when I bring it into the importer, it will be like, oh, you're taking these photos 8 years ago, and Lightroom doesn't know any better. Now looking back at these images, these don't tell me anything of what these are. I have to go through these old folders individually and then go through an image and be like, oh yes, that's what this was, and rename it. Also, having 40,000 images named DSC0001 is ultra confusing and can easily cause issues of accidentally overwriting files. So creating a system early on for storing your files is key. Mistake number 9 is shooting manual for every situation. Now, if you're just starting out, shooting everything in manual mode is an essential part of learning. However, once you start to understand the exposure triangle, shooting in manual mode isn't always the best choice. Learning how to use your other modes like aperture priority and shutter priority is kind of essential. If you shoot everything in manual mode, you're gonna miss a lot of key moments. You're gonna be pulling in your camera, trying to fiddle up settings, and you're just gonna miss the shot. Aperture and shutter priority modes is basically like a manual automatic mode where you control one setting and let your camera do the rest of the thinking for you. This is great because you just need to point and shoot. If your image is too dark or too bright, you can use the exposure composition dial to fix that, which is usually that third dial on your camera that no one really understands how to use when they first start out. Shutter priority is great for when you want to ensure your images don't have motion blur, or you can use aperture priority mode, which is basically the same thing, but you're just setting your aperture and the camera will figure out the shutter speed and the ISO for you. Essentially, when you grasp these two modes, it's like riding your bike with one hand. And the last mistake is only shooting one type of photography. When I first started photography, I thought I wanted to be a portrait photographer, and now I realize I was a big mistake, and I actually don't like doing portraiture at all. Basically, like, come up with this like new like persona. Oh my god, you look great. Like, it's just I just did not like it at all. Unless I was like shooting a guy, then it was like, oh yeah, dude, you look great. Truth is, if I didn't try other types of photography, I probably would have never touched photography again. Now, I definitely have tried every damn niche type of photography out there. Astro, street, architecture, underwater, macro, you name it, I've definitely tried it. And the truth is, every single one of these types of photography are completely different from each other. Now, if you already found your favorite type of photography and doing it consistently, then you probably don't care about this all that much. There's really so much to learn from every niche that will really push to develop your skills. There's really just so many different techniques. One niche, you may be using focus stacking all the time. Some you might be doing time tracking. You may be learning how to use flashes and lighting. There's just so many different techniques out there. If you only do one type of photography, you really limit how much you can develop your skills. And there's really no better way than trying it out. Just get out there. And one more mistake I want to add is not having a community. Honestly, just having other photography friends makes photography so much more enjoyable. Going out for photo walks, taking photos of each other, sharing photos, asking what you could have improved on, what you could have done better. Oh my gosh, I had water right here the entire time. Oh, well, whatever. So if you don't already have a community, I strongly recommend just trying to find one. Search up a local neighborhood club or something like that. If you're still gassed up and want to find some more camera gear, you should check out this video where I talk about my favorite practical camera accessories that are actually just useful. And if you like this video or even disliked it, you know how to let me know. Or if you want to keep in touch for future videos, consider subscribing. Until next time, ciao.